21. We have read the passage just a few minutes ago, verse number 9, down through verse number 27. The city of God. If you think back, those of you who are married, some of you were on your marriage day, you were the bride, some of you were the groom. And even though there is no right or wrong, there are some times that the bride does not want to be seen by the groom dressed up in her wedding gown before that moment, that whatever that looks like, the doors are opened and the groom looks down that crowded space or outside and he sees his beautiful bride, and maybe that was the first time that he has seen her in her gown. How many of you, if you're married, that was how you did it, that the groom did not see the bride? How many of you were that way, right? Yeah, a fair number. How many were not? How many were not? There we go. All right, roughly half and half, right? But regardless, what a joy it is for a groom to see his bride on the wedding day. When we think about this passage, we are drawn into that imagery, we're drawn into that feeling, that emotive state, because it starts out with the angel telling John, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And if you can imagine that occurring, was it a surprise then for John when the angel told him in verse 9 that he would take him to see the bride and he showed him a city? Seems like that might have been a surprise. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues spoke to me saying, "Come, I'll show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he brings him up to a great high mountain. He shows him the city, Jerusalem. Doesn't seem quite right that he would kind of pull a fast one on John. I get to see the bride. But if we remember that the city as the bride is really set in contrast to a different city, that all along this has been what John would anticipate. Because if we go all the way back to Revelation chapter 17, verse number 1, it says, "Then one of the 7 angels who held the 7 bowls said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on the waters, with whom many of the kings of earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk.' And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns." Really what we're talking about here is a tremendous amount of parallels between the two. That if we go back to what this looked like for John, then came one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues and spoke to me saying, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. And so really what we find is a lot of parallels. Both passages begin with one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, right? Both passages begin with that, potentially the same angel. And then both of them say, "Come, I will show you." And they identify that. And then John is carried away in the Spirit in both places, in one to the wilderness and in the other to a great high mountain. This is why one commentator, as he was trying to describe everything that's happening from chapter 17 all the way into here, chapter 21, he called this the tale of 2 cities, the harlot and the bride. And it's good for us just to see how Scripture itself creates that contrast that is there. He is attempting to bring out those 2 different pictures. If you follow the beast, your reward is the harlot. If you follow the Lamb, your reward is the bride. And it's intended to be like, man, that's not a hard choice. That is not a hard choice. And that scarlet woman is pretty hideous, and the bride is pretty amazing, but that's exactly the point, right? That is seeing clearly. That is understanding what's happening. And so that's what we are presented with. That's what John is presented with here in this passage. But we might then ask the question, what is so great about New Jerusalem? What is so great about New Jerusalem? So we're going to look at just two aspects of New Jerusalem as revealed in this passage that ought to just blow our minds. And we're going to look at it simply as the construction of the city that reveals the glory of God, and then the conditions of the city that reveal God's grace. So we'll begin with the first one. The construction of the city reveals God's glory. Revelation chapter 21, verse number 10 and 11, it says, "He carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city of Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. Its radiance was like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal." You know, if the one thing I want you to walk away with is that the main characteristic of the holy city is that it reveals the glory of God. The main characteristic of the holy city is that it contains the glory of God. And not contains in the sense of restricts, but contains in the sense that that is what it is all about. We can notice that John is emphasizing here in this passage the transparent nature of the city. And most times when we think about gems, we don't think about them being transparent. They might be a little bit translucent sometimes. Most of the times they're opaque, right? But this is a transparent thing. That's why he says at the end, like a jasper, clear as crystal. And we'll see this come out again and again through this passage. The whole point of these gems is that they reveal something else. It's not about the gem itself. It's about what is coming through them. And what is coming through them? It is the glory of God that is passing through the holy city. And that ultimately is what is glorious about it. And so as we begin to walk through this, we begin to understand these different aspects of its construction that point towards the glory of God. God's glory is the people of God made mature. Look at verse number 12 through 14. It says, "It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. And on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb." You say, how is that talking about the people of God? Well, if we think about how the New Testament describes the bride of Christ, who in the New Testament is the bride of Christ? Who is the bride of Christ in the New Testament? You tell me. The church. In the Old Testament, the wife of Yahweh is who? Israel. And so here in Revelation, we have the wife of Yahweh and we have the bride of Christ combined together to form the people of God. And so when we think about the city and you say, why is it called the bride of Christ when the church is called the bride of Christ? And I would say it is because it is both the church and Israel combined. And we see that in the description of its construction. Because if we think about what it is saying here with the construction, you have 12 gates with 12 angels, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. So the gates are emphasizing Israel. And then the wall has 12 foundations, and the 12 foundations, it emphasizes the church. And this really is consistent, I would suggest, with what is recorded in the New Testament. You remember Paul? When Paul says you have Israel and you have the Gentiles and you have one people, you have another people, and he said God in his wisdom has determined to make a third people. And what's the third people? The church. And so now you have 3 peoples. The Gentiles, the church, and Israel. And here in Revelation, you have all the people of God joined together. Specifically, the 2 that have taken God's full attention. First, before the cross, Israel. Now, after the cross, the church. And in the millennial kingdom, Israel will again get the full focus of God. And so what this does is it shows this connectiveness that is there. And so I go all the way back to this statement. Don't look at B yet. Continue to look at A. It says, God's glory is the people of God made mature. Made mature. Now think about this. Was Israel mature? Or were they a mess? How many of you would say they were a mess? Okay, we won't do the other one. Is the church mature? Or is it a mess? How many of you would say it's a mess? How many of you say First Baptist Church is a mess? I was talking about, I'm not going to say another city. I almost did with that, man. That is on YouTube. So never mind. I would say First Baptist Church is a mess. And that is the truth of it. It's actually part of why we continue to labor together, is to make it less of a mess and more mature, right? We're a mess. Will we always be a mess? Yeah, we will. Because we are sinners saved by grace. And I'm not glorying in the mess. I'm glorying in what will come and in the process we get to be involved in now. And I'm not arguing that because we're a mess now, we shouldn't ever then, work on our maturity. We should. We ought to. But we could go through, and I could spend the next hour talking about the ways that we are a mess and the things we'd like to see change, both in the way things operate, but also just in our hearts and we as a people. Because that's the reality, right? That's the reality. That's what we're dealing with. And make no mistake, that is how it will be. That's Israel. That's the church. Okay, what happens during the millennial kingdom? When the church has already been raptured, they come back. Israel is a part of that. They're all the people of God. Is the millennial kingdom, the followers of God in the millennial kingdom, are they going to be a mess? Good question. Well, they're not going to start a mess, or will they? Because who enters the millennial kingdom? Humans that have lived through the tribulation. They've seen some things. And that God has saved just believers that'll be entered in, I believe. It's the separation of the sheep and the goats. And so the sheep will enter into the millennial kingdom. And you think about that. These are believers who have lived through the tribulation, but they are still like you. They're still like me. And will they be a mess? They'll be a mess. But it'll be a perfect kingdom. It'll be a perfect king. You'll have perfect rulers. But then at the end of 1,000 years, Satan is released. And what does he do? He deceives. And what happens? This big mess revolts. And so are they a mess? They're going to be a mess. And I would suggest that that's actually the point. Because you look at every kind of epoch or age of humanity, and it's like, man, that was a mess. 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 Millennial kingdom, still a mess. When is it going to not be a mess? Answer, New Jerusalem. That's when everything changes. And why does it change? Because God changes every heart, but He also removes sin. And that is so radical. That is the bride of Christ. That's the wife of Yahweh. That is the work of the Spirit made mature. And that's what it's talking about. The glory of God is in that. Because nobody will be able to say, man, I really did a good job, and I'm really proud of myself as a believer. Because you had your chance, and you screwed it up. And we all did. And even what we did here, we can only say it was God at work. And then He removes the sin nature, and we're saying, see, it really was God at work. And He receives all the glory. God's glory is the people of God made mature. God's glory is the people of God also made holy. So how does the construction of the city reveal this? Holiness is a cube. Have you ever thought about that? I think it's true. Let me try to explain it, right? Holiness is a cube. Verse 16. The city lies 4 square. Its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. Now, as far as I know, and you can fact check me on this, and maybe after the service tell me I'm wrong, but I believe the only other cube we find in Scripture is the Holy of Holies. 20 by 20 by 20. Roughly 30 feet cubed. And I would suggest that New Jerusalem is the new Holy of Holies. That New Jerusalem is a picture of the Holy of Holies presented, made large. That the Holy of Holies is now the city, the actual city. Now we could talk about its size. Let me give you some pictures. And this is just kind of fun. So let me ask the question. Maybe I shouldn't ask this question, but I'm going to. Is it literal? Yes. I believe it is. I believe it's literal. Could it be symbolic? Well, my faith would not be shook if it's symbolic. And I would suggest yours shouldn't be either. In other words, could God be saying, I am going to give you a picture of the very best way I can to describe this that you will understand? That could be the case. But do I think it's literal? I believe it's literal. Some of that is how I interpret the Bible. That puts me into that position. I don't feel like I'm forced, but puts me into that position. So I believe it's literal. But nonetheless, this is how big it is. I mean, that's pretty big, right? Now, that's a city. That is a city. But of course, it is also this size. Because it's not just, flat like we would anticipate a city. It is also tall like a cube, right? And that is so radically different than of what we think. And you'd say, how could a cube? You say, that's not going to fit well on a sphere called the earth. And you're like, yeah, this cube is so big that it doesn't fit well. And I would say, God's going to have to figure that out. I don't know what he's going to do. It is so big, it doesn't fit well on a perfectly round sphere, right? Or a sphere that is the shape of the earth, even if we don't say it's perfectly round, whatever. But I think God probably has a plan, right? I think he's got it covered. But it would look like this. Now, if you think about how many people could fit into a city like that, where you would potentially have layers upon layers within the city. It is really mind-boggling. But now here I think is the point. The point is that the Holy of Holies has been expanded. That's what we're talking about. The holiness is a cube. Secondly, holiness is access. Holiness is access. What do I mean by that? Verse number 17 through 19a, the first part of 19. It says, he also measured its wall, 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold, like clear glass. Again, we have that clear glass, which is not how we view gold, right? The foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. 144 cubits, that's about 220 feet. He cannot be talking about the height. Because 220 feet does not do anything to 1,500 miles, which is the size of the cube. 1,500 miles squared, right? And so how is it that it's 122 feet? And I think or 220 feet. I think the answer there for the 220 feet is we're talking about its thickness. It is 223 feet thick. That goes around and all the way up, presumably, of this city. Walls in ancient times, we understand, were built for security. But here I would suggest the point is not security, but is access. And that's why you have these gates that are emphasized. And I say this also because of the foundations of the wall. They were adorned with jewels. And I think those jewels are, in fact, important. I'm not going to go through and describe each jewel, but what I would like to point out is that after we work through exactly which gem is being identified, we discover that the gems are the same gems that are found on the breastplate of the high priest, which he was to wear when he approached the Shekinah glory in the Holy of Holies. And so this foundation is inlaid with these gemstones that are the exact gemstones that are found in the breastplate of the high priest. And when we think about how that foundation as well is also identified as the church, we have a beautiful picture of full and complete access to God. So the high spirit had access to the Holy of Holies, and this wall that surrounds the city is given the same kind of authority to provide that access. And so the wall opens up the door in order for people to have access to the Holy of Holies. And I would suggest that's the point of the construction. The holiness is a cube, it's access, it's also a treasure. Verse number 21. It says, "And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass." So, of course, I think it is important to recognize the great value that we're talking about, the treasure of what is being built by Jesus as well. All the things that we know to be valuable are things that make up the holy city of God. And verse 21 closes out the description of the construction of the city, and it emphasizes the value of the place as well. For the ancient world, pearls were considered the most luxurious of all jewels. That might blow your mind, but think about Jesus when he told about the parable of the pearl of great price. And what did they have to do to get that pearl? Sell everything. Why? Because that pearl was so valuable. And so they viewed it from that standpoint. And each gate is made of a single great pearl. That's incredible. It's incredible. Now, we've all heard jokes about people attempting to arrive at the pearly gates, right, with gold that they collected from earth. And, of course, what does St. Peter say to them? Why did you bring pavement, right? And so we chuckle at that, but it comes from this verse, right? And the street of the city was pure gold. Now, if you notice, it says the street. That is a definitive article. That is a singular street. So you say, why does it say the street? And again, if you just put yourself into the situation of an ancient city, in an ancient city you would have a main thoroughfare, a main street. And that would then mimic ancient cities where you would have that one street from which all other, that was the artery, right? And all other streets came out of that artery. And so likely that's what we're talking about. In fact, if we think about the two witnesses that were killed and their dead bodies were laid out on what? The street. You say, which street? Just any street in the city. Well, no, probably it was the main thoroughfare, right? It was the artery, and that was the street that it was laid out. And so if we begin to picture what this would look like, it's difficult because we're talking about a cube. We don't know exactly what that all looks like. What does a main street look like there? I don't know. It is challenging. You say, doesn't that mean it's symbolic? And I would say, it doesn't mean it is, but certainly you would have some of those arguments that would be put forward by those friends of ours that might view it that way. Ultimately, we would go back to ask the question, what is the purpose of the street? The street of the city was pure gold like transparent glass. Now, that is like no gold that you and I have ever seen or ever will see until we get to this place. And what is the point of the transparent glass? Again and again, I've pointed it out. It is because it lets the glory of God shine through it. The purpose of the street, like the purpose of the city, is to radiate the glory of God, not to reflect its own glory. What a glorious thing. The construction of the city reveals God's glory. The conditions of the city reveals God's grace. The conditions of the city reveals God's grace. Look at verse 22, Revelation 21:22. It says, "And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb." This, I think, would have been a massive shock. You know, Jewish portrayals of the New Jerusalem emphasize the presence of that end-time temple. In fact, Ezekiel 40 through 48 talks about the temple. That's like its entire focus of those chapters. And the point, that is part of the reason that I and many others believe that there must be a millennial kingdom first, and then the new heavens and the new earth, including the New Jerusalem. Why? Because the New Jerusalem does not have a temple. And Ezekiel 40 through 48 clearly points towards a new temple. When is the new temple going to be? And I would suggest millennial kingdom. But can we imagine how this must have shocked John? The literal translation of this verse is, "And I did not see a temple." Just feel the significance of that for John. John is brought to New Jerusalem, and he'd be like, "Where's the temple?" It's like, there's no temple. It's like, what's going on? There's no temple. And that's what he's talking about. I saw no temple in the city. Why? The Shekinah glory made the temple holy before the cross. When the veil is torn, the Spirit of God permanently indwelt believers. So therefore, it was the Spirit of God that made believers holy after the cross. That's us now. But here, the entire city has been made into the Holy of Holies. And so when God resides with his people, there is no need for a temple. He does not visit us. He lives with us. It's really hard for us to fathom. But since the beginning of time, God has visited mankind. But through that process of mankind, he is now or will bring mankind to the point where he is able to live with them. How do you put that into words? I have no idea. But John here, under the inspiration of the Spirit, is pointing out there is no temple because there is no need. God is ever present. There's also no need for sun or moon. Look at verse number 23. "And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it." This is really, if we think about this verse, this is really a full expression of what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 4:6. "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." And so, Jesus Christ was a full expression of God. One day, you and I will be a full expression of God. Because he will have changed us entirely. And by full expression, I don't mean that we will, have all of his attributes. But when people look at us, they will see the Father. Because just like the city, we will radiate out who God is. And so if we go back then, and I'm going to go back, to verse 24, it says, "By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it." This is really speaking of the conversion of the nations. One of the purposes of the seals and the trumpets and the bowls and the tribulation is to convict the nations of their sin and call them to repentance. Do people get saved in the tribulation? Absolutely. Many. One of the purposes of the benevolent rule of Jesus in the millennial kingdom is to draw people to him. So will people get saved in the millennial kingdom? Many. Many will get saved. Verse 24 then is the fulfillment of passages like Isaiah 60, where the prophecy is made that the wealth of the nations will be brought to God. But here, John, under inspiration of the Spirit, turns the phrase. And the wealth of their nation, their glory, is not their goods. Their glory are their lives, their souls. What we're talking about here is salvation. Now think about this for us. What is the purpose of the church? What's the mission that Jesus has given us? What has he told us to do? What is the Great Commission? What's the Great Commission? Make disciples of all nations. And the church labors at that. Will we be ultimately successful? Well, it depends what you define as success. Will people come to Jesus in faith? Yes. But will we make will we get to the point where all the nations are turned to God? And the answer there is no. The church will ultimately fail if you look at it from that standpoint. When will that occur? It'll occur here. It'll occur not through the efforts of the church, because the church will ultimately not succeed in that sense. It will occur here because God will do it by himself. He will make that happen. And that's what it's talking about. The glory of God gives its light. Its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. You know, if that's the purpose of the church, if that's what we're supposed to be doing here, is to make disciples, then what are we supposed to do there? What do we do in the new city? Worship God and enjoy him forever. And you say, okay, but isn't that our big goal? And then making disciples is underneath that goal? And I would say, yeah, it is. Now, but one day, that will stop. There will be no more disciples to make. You know, I think it's important for us to just wrap our minds around that, because sometimes we lose sight of that. We, you and I, have the privilege to be about what God is doing now in making disciples. And truly, I believe that we can choose not to do it. And God will still make those disciples. But we will miss out, because we won't be a part of it. And he has given us that opportunity to make disciples. And there will come a day where we will look back and we will wonder, Lord, why wasn't I more involved in that? Why wasn't that more seriously a part of my life plan? And this is why he's given us his word and given us this commission and called us to it, is because that is there for us. What a great opportunity we have. No need for the sun or moon. We also see no need for closed gates. Verse number 25 and 26. It says, and its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. They will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations. Now, in the ancient world, the gates of the city were closed at night to keep unwanted people out. So why does it say that they will not be shut during the day? Most cities didn't have them shut during the day. And then why does it repeat the no night thing? Why does it go back into that again? And I would suggest that the point is that the gates will never be shut. In other words, the point is the gates will never be shut by day, and since there is no night there, they will not be shut by night. That it is a complete and total realm of access and safety. In other words, all are welcome all the time. Why? Because God has done a work in which sin is gone. There's no danger, and there's nobody that is unwanted. Sin is departed, and there is no one who is unworthy, not because of themselves, but because of what God has done. And that leads us into that next condition, no uncleanness. And here he details for us, no uncleanness. He details for us what that looks like. But nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false. So all uncleanness is gone, and we think about all of the uncleanliness that is there in the Levitical law and all of those things, but he also says all of those who do things that are detestable. And you think about all the abominations that we've read about in Revelation, that is the same word. So it's talking about those who practice abominations are gone. And then he says, or false. And we go back to what the whole point of Satan is, the deceiver. He goes around lying. Earth dwellers follow him in their lies. And so he's saying that even those who speak lies are gone. In other words, sin itself is gone. And what's left? Only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. The book of life that is made possible by the Lamb. Because without the Lamb, we would not be in it. Why? Because we are unclean, detestable, and false. So what is it that makes us different than that? It is the Lamb. It is the cross. That is the only thing that changes us. That's why it is the Lamb's book of life. It is upon him that we all rely. And that book is modeled after that roll of citizens in ancient cities. And so it just begs the question, do you belong to the Lamb. Dear friend, you cannot enter the city unless you belong to the Lamb. You say, why can't I enter the city if I'm a good enough person? Because you cannot be good enough. Because you are detestable and abominable and false in some way and somehow. That is the case for every human that has ever lived. And you say, how do I get free from that? And it says you have to turn to Jesus in faith. You have to ask him to save you from your sins. You have to accept him as your Savior. You have to become a part of the people of God. So I would just close out our service by asking these simple questions. Are you in the Lamb's Book of Life? Are you engaged in the purpose God has given us here? We have been given a commission for a reason. Are you living out that purpose for the right reasons? It's one thing to be about God's business. It's another thing to be about God's business because we value the things he values. And then finally, how can you meditate further on what God has in store for us? How can we put this into our hearts, into our minds? How can we dwell on these things?